Palestinians talk about sumud, meaning fortitude or steadfastness. And a feature of Palestinian resistance over the decades is really the remarkable resilience of Palestinian communities, despite everything: occupation, repression, invasion, and now, of course, a genocidal war. It's impressive, but not unique, because, of course, many colonized peoples have maintained long struggles. The Algerians against French colonialism, the Vietnamese against the French, and then, of course, the Americans. And in Ireland, here against the British, and in India, there are many other examples. What makes the Palestinians' case somewhat different is that for over 70 years, they've been in effect in struggle with one arm tied behind their backs. What I mean by that is that the Nakba of 1948 displaced most of the Palestinian population, it atomized communities, and it left Palestinian society weakened systemically, so that Palestinians have since lacked the economic and political resources, particularly in terms of an organised working class on which many national liberation movements have depended. I want to look at Palestinian struggles before and after the Nakba, and at their continuing potential to bring change despite this critical weakness. So, from the First World War onwards, the Zionist movement was locked into a relationship with Western imperialism, something Rad has just been referring to. This was purposive. This was a directed initiative by the Zionist movement. The aims of the leader of the Zionist movement at the time of the First World War, Chaim Weizmann, were, in the words of an Israeli historian, I quote, to serve as a colonial border guard in the service of British imperialism. Now that, for the British, was an offer too good to refuse. It produced the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and their British agreement to establish in Palestine the base on which to construct an independent Jewish state. So that from the time the British took full control in Palestine, they facilitated land deals for the Zionists and the creation of an armed force. Palestinian leaders had already told the Zionists that land settlement would produce resistance. So as early as the 1890s, a prominent Palestinian official told Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism, he said, I quote him, "In the name of God, let Palestine be left alone. If it wasn't," he said, "there would be serious consequences in terms of mass resistance." When Jewish immigration to Palestine was stepped up in the 1920s, resistance was indeed soon underway. In 1921, Palestinians who were being evicted from the land fought with Jewish demonstrators, and the British, then the colonial power, responded with bombing from the air, bringing the RAF to attack Palestinian areas in the major cities and to attack Palestinian villages, and introduced from Ireland the hated Black and Tans, an auxiliary police force which was notorious for its brutality. Palestinian resistance continued throughout the 20s and into the 1930s. It followed a pattern familiar from other anti-colonial struggles, especially those in which access to the land was under threat. There were demonstrations in the cities, often involving peasants forced from the land by the Zionist acquisition of large estates. After clashes in 1929, particularly significant mass mobilisation, the British imprisoned and executed key Palestinian leaders. An echo, interestingly, importantly, I think, of their response to the Easter Rising in Ireland in 1916. And many of the key British officials at this time were people who'd been around at the time of the Easter Rising. So as Palestinians were forced from the land, they confronted a dual challenge, that of the British and of the settlers. With the settlers' main force, the Haganah, and additional armed groups that the British helped to officer and to equip. So the British are aligned with the Zionists' key military and paramilitary forces. So Palestinian demonstrations by this point are dominated by two slogans, not surprisingly: down with the English and down with the colonisers. In 1936, Palestinian protests erupted into a national confrontation with the two enemies. This intifada was impressive. I'll just pause for a second to note that in recent years, in English media and common uses of English, we've borrowed a new word from Arabic, intifada. I think everyone knows what it means. And the scale and energy of the intifadas has sort of made its impression in the language. So for Palestinians, the first intifada was the intifada of 1936. And it produced mass mobilisation the British struggled to control. Even the conservative Palestinian leadership, which was headed by traditional landowning families, was compelled to call what they called a general strike, really a mass movement of non-cooperation. The British reacted savagely, blowing up whole sections of cities and destroying villages. When we want to think about the savagery of the assault on Gaza and the issues which Ghada Khami was raising earlier, we have to think back to the models of repression which the Zionists have emulated. And the British were there doing it from the beginning. Like many national leaderships worldwide that have contested colonial control, the Palestinian clans of the traditional leadership were conservative and focused on maintaining their own interest. They were hopelessly compromised. Some, for example, had sold land to the Zionist movement, resulting in thousands of forced evictions of peasant families. The traditional leadership organised into something called the Arab High Committee. After 6 months, they called off this general strike, this movement of non-cooperation. But they failed to rein in the movement, because of course the movement was angry and radical. And activists at this point launched their own activities, including, for the first time, guerrilla warfare, which the British, again, struggled to control. The British brought in 30,000 troops. Bear in mind the population of Palestine at this time was not more than about 1.3 million. They killed 5,000 Palestinians and executed over 100. Again, let's think about where the Zionists learned their techniques from. By 1939, Britain had effectively decapitated the Palestinian anti-colonial resistance, the beneficiary, of course, being the Zionist movement. At this point in the 30s, Jewish immigration had increased massively, not least because of Nazi repression in Europe. In 1922, there had been about 80,000 Jews in Palestine. By 1945, the figure was 550,000. And settlers at this point constituted almost a third of the whole population. They controlled the country's key industries and much of its commerce, and had organised highly effective fighting forces working alongside the British to suppress Palestinian resistance. Under these circumstances, the Palestinian response have been impressive, but always restrained by the leadership of the traditional families, particularly two very important clans, the Nashashibis and the Husseinis, about which I'll say more later on. In 1948, Jewish settler forces, of course, overwhelmed the Palestinians and the feeble resistance of Arab armies. They expelled into neighbouring states over 700,000 people, so that about 85% of the population in territories that came under Zionist control had been dispossessed. The State of Israel, as you know, was declared, a state which had been, in effect, jointly constructed by the British, by the Zionists and their British backers. It's not true that the Zionists and the British agreed about everything. For example, the pace of migration was never enough, of immigration, to satisfy the leaders of the Zionist movement. But by and large, the British had facilitated settlement, crucially suppressed the national resistance. They prepared the ground for the establishment of Israel over the decades. What was the impact? The Nakba of '48 shattered Palestinian society. Communities were ripped out of towns and villages, families were atomised, cultural resources were pillaged, the key networks of the national movement were destroyed. There were attempts by some of that old Palestinian leadership to lobby leaders of the Arab states to intervene on the Palestinians' behalf, but none were successful. Not least because regimes in states such as Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, in which the Palestinians were now refugees, saw the Palestinians as a dangerous, destabilising force. The result, over a decade, Palestinian politics was paralysed as the diaspora, the new diaspora, struggled to come to terms with mass displacement. Now, something which is very rarely addressed in analyses of this period, including in the academic literature, is that refugee episodes like the Nakba always have a class dimension. In 1948, the Palestinian bourgeoisie, with its access to capital and to links in the wider region, moved first. They were able, under the intense pressure from the Zionist movement, to exercise some sort of choice about their destinations as refugees and to move some of their resources to Arab capitals. Palestinian professionals, now Palestinian society was probably the most educated in the region. There were lots of doctors and engineers and legal folks and academics of various sorts and so on. Palestinian professionals like them were also able to make relatively quick exits. They were in demand in oil economies of the Gulf and became established in what you might call states in construction, such as Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. The mass of the peasantry, the working class and the urban poor had a different fate. They were forced to cross the new borders by Zionist militias. It's interesting, I think, that the poorest Palestinians from the most marginal rural areas of the north of Palestine, who were expelled into Lebanon, are still Lebanon's poorest and most vulnerable people. When we talk about the Nakba, still being an element of life today, that's one of the expressions of the displacement. When organised resistance by Palestinians was resumed in the early 1960s, it was based in what we might call a new proto-bourgeoisie, a new Palestinian capitalist class in formation within the emerging capitalist states of the Gulf. This was well symbolised by Yasser Arafat. So Arafat was a civil engineer who had become a millionaire in Kuwait. There's this huge boom of the building of infrastructure and so on in the Gulf states at this time, and Palestinians play a very important role. Arafat and his friends from the Gulf region formed Al-Fatah. a renewed national movement, but one marked by the past and its origins in the 50s and 60s in the petro-economy, the Gulf oil economies. So the leadership of al-Fatah, who in the course of a few years gained control of the PLO, they wanted the liberation of Palestine. The new capitalists were also excluded, along with everybody else from Palestine. But, like the Arab Higher Committee of the 1930s, which had restrained the mass movement, they also wanted control of the mass of Palestinians. Arafat himself was part of the al-Husseini clan that had played that particular role in the 1930s, who were significantly based in Gaza. Arafat's family were associated with Gaza. And Arafat and his friends in the new leadership of the movement, they aspired to a Palestinian state, an independent state, but a state like other states in the region. A state like the states in which they were achieving new status and wealth. Arafat was, in the language of the Marxist left, the bourgeois nationalist. And this was to mark the project then launched by the PLO, and which played a significant part in his defeat. And I'll try and explain what I mean by this. Armed attacks against Israel in 1965, it galvanized the Palestinian communities of the Arab states. There's a wonderful book, I think it's probably out of print now, by Rosemary Sayegh, called Palestinians from Peasants to Revolutionaries. And it describes the impact in refugee camps in Lebanon when the... Sorry, getting overexcited there. Palestinian camps in Lebanon when the armed struggle was launched in the 1960s. So communities were energized by the new fight back. A bit like the way in which Palestinians and others across the world have been energized by the current resistance in Gaza. But almost as soon as those struggles began, they were being restrained by the same old problems. Arafat and his friends struck what you might call a Faustian pact with the most wealthy Arab states. So what Arafat said to the rulers of the Gulf states, and in particular to the King of Saudi Arabia, was that in exchange for money and weaponry, that Palestinians would agree to never intervene in the domestic politics of the wider Middle East. They called this is the term used by Arafat and others, they called this the policy of non-interference. And it proved to be a disaster. And this brings us to a key issue. The relationship over the past 4 or 5 decades between Palestinian struggles and other mass movements in the Arab states. The achievement of the PLO was to relaunch Palestinian resistance, putting Palestine in effect back on the map. You know, if you read Israeli archives and propaganda of the 1950s, the leaders of the Zionist movement really thought they got away with it. And that the Palestinians weren't coming back in effect. So when the Palestinians were back with a bang in the 1960s, this was a really major achievement. At the same time, the Palestinian leadership managed, quite self-consciously, to isolate Palestinian struggles from the region's most potent force for change. The mass movements in the Arab countries, and in particular, the Arab working class. Arafat and the leadership of the movement couldn't trust the mass of Palestinians. They always sought to control them in the mode of the old leadership of the 1930s. But Palestinians were under the most acute repression, especially after the War of 1967 brought Gaza and the West Bank under Israeli control. And the Palestinians maintained resistance in many forms, notably, for example, refusing Israeli efforts to create local networks of collaborators. The Israelis tried when it was clear that Palestinian resistance was back in a big way, the Israelis tried all sorts of techniques. For example, they created something called the Village Leagues, into which they hoped to buy in Palestinian leadership as collaborators. It failed. The resistance grew from the roots. Revolutionary socialists outside Palestine, in the West, and particularly in this country, importantly, our current in the SWP, backed this national struggle. We offered unconditional support, we said, but not without relevant criticism. Here, of course, we stood and we stand in the tradition of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, recognizing that national struggles can contest imperialism even if they fall short of advancing strategies for revolutionary change. This remains, of course, our approach and something perhaps that we can discuss. During the 1980s, ordinary Palestinians under occupation resisted increasingly effectively. In 1987, they launched a new intifada, which began significantly in Gaza, which lasted almost 4 years and caused immense problems for Israel. These struggles were massive. I mean, 87, 88, there was barely a Palestinian family which wasn't engaged in various ways in the intifada. Women playing an enormously significant role, which had not happened on the same scale hitherto. So these struggles were really courageous and energetic. They were necessarily, of course, anti-imperialist. They were contesting a state which was at the heart of imperialist networks in the region, backed by the US. And they stimulated solidarity across the Arab states. They also prompted emulation, imitation in a positive sense. So in Jordan, in Sudan, Algeria, Kuwait, and crucially in Egypt, millions of people took to the streets, and in some cases, again, very importantly in Egypt, the activists in solidarity organised solidarity strikes. Perhaps the most important moment in Palestinian modern history, when workers in the major workplaces of the Nile Delta in Egypt were prepared to organise major workplace walkouts in solidarity with Intifada.
1 minute, sir.
Thank you. Arafat was appalled. The Intifada, prompting this solidarity, threatened the policy of non-interference. It threatened his guns and money and the status of himself and his friends in the Palestinian leadership among Arab kings and presidents. And you might find this shocking. It was very shocking at the time. Arafat sent leading members of the PLO to states like Egypt to help suppress the solidarity movement. Arafat himself travelled to Kuwait to smooth relations with Kuwait's leaders and to head off solidarity protests. In the case of Egypt, the PLO had turned its back on the most potent political force in the region. Its working class was vital to the Palestinians, not least because their own predicament resulting from the Nakba of 1948 meant that Palestinian society lacked the economic and political weight of a genuine proletariat, so that the struggle for national liberation was continuously weakened by the refugee predicament. Israel was nonetheless compelled to act because the Intifada was so widespread and continuous. It used a willing PLO to strike so-called peace deals. This was the start of the Oslo process, that offered Palestinians the illusion of an independent state with Arafat as president. Israel and the US dragged out talks for years, of course, until in 2000, Palestinians rose against the Israelis in a further intifada. This too fell out of control of the PLO and stimulated a response across the Arab world. So, for example, going back to Egypt again, it played a key role in reacting to the Palestinian movement. The renewed intifada, the renewed resistance, stimulated a reactivation of the workers, or helped to stimulate a reactivation of the workers' movement in Egypt, and in 2002, in what we might call a rehearsal of events to come in 2011, with the Egyptian revolution, demonstrators for the first time since the 1940s captured Tahrir Square in the centre of Cairo, announcing a Tahrir Intifada. You can see the connection between the Egyptian movement and the Palestinian movement. Okay, the contradiction in PLO strategy was clear to see. Many Palestinians had now abandoned the PLO, especially when it became clear that the so-called state, the mini-state they were being offered under Arafat, was nothing more than a patchwork of enclaves on the West Bank controlled by Israeli forces. PLO leaders had isolated Palestinians from the increasingly intense struggles in the Arab region. Now, those PLO leaders were not only collaborators with Israel, but continuously aligned with rulers like Mubarak of Egypt and Assad of Syria, whose interest in the neoliberal era, we're now talking, the course of the last 25 years or so, was the increasingly aggressive exploitation of workers of the region. So these were the rulers with whom the Palestinian leadership was aligned. The outcome was inevitable. A new generation of activists in Palestine emerged to claim leadership of the national struggle. For the first time in Palestinian history, Islamists came to the fore in the shape of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Hamas, of course, effectively the Palestinian chapter of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood. These Islamist organisations, are further from the revolutionary traditions we embrace, and at the same time have been closer to the mass of people and their aspiration to continue the struggle. So Hamas, like all Islamist currents, riddled with contradictions, and yet have already inspired solidarity actions that can challenge imperialism. Most important, I think, they demonstrate that Sumud, Palestinians' fortitude, shows that despite everything the Israelis and their allies can throw at them, Palestinians, to use one of their most important slogans, exist and resist. You'll have seen it on the placards of the PSC. Exist, resist, return. The savagery of the attack on Gaza by the Israelis shows how infuriating it is for Israel's rulers that they still can't silence the Palestinians. Okay, concluding remark, Chair, if I may. There's one more thing, I think. The rise of Hamas is not the only expression of continuing resistance. Now we also have the BDS movement. Maybe we have time to discuss that. Launched by young activists some 15 years ago, also as part of their desire to develop a much more intransigent and effective element to the national movement than was provided by the likes of the PLO. And a determined attempt by them to break down the isolation of the Palestinians by working to internationalise their cause. BDS calls on all of us to play a role. And it's making big progress, despite what you might hear from Israel and partisans of Israel. Since it was launched, the BDS movement has been highly effective. I think it's one of the reasons why the massive movement in countries like this one, in solidarity with Gaza, has emerged so quickly. I found in going through my bookshelves recently a pamphlet from 1979 Palestine lives. And in conclusion, it comments, it argues that of course it's the Palestinians and their resistance and their aspiration for freedom which drives the movement internationally. It says here, there's little enough we can do thousands of miles away, but more than we think. Britain helped set up the Zionist state. The United States maintains it with massive military and economic aid. Israel depends heavily on trade with the West. Economic decisions, trade deals are made in towns and cities all over the world that affect the position, status and power of Israel. Wherever we can, we must work to break these links with Zionism. So, 1979, how much more relevant that is today. The key to change, of course, lies in Gaza and the West Bank and in the industrial cities of the Arab states, but we've all got a role to play. Thanks.